In the Fortune 500, there are less than 10% of women who are CEOs. And you go down the pipeline into the C-suite and senior leadership, it's about 25, 24%. And as you go down the management pipeline, at that very first level, when men and women equally entering the workforce, at that first level of promotion, you already start to see the disparity, whereas 60% of men and 40% women now are represented at that first line of leadership. So our goal in this work is to make sure we're moving the pipeline so that we can change those numbers faster. So this data just came out, but in the S&P 500, there are only 39 trailblazing women. That means 461 of them are men. And the pace of change is so slow that it's going to take us well over 100 years to even approach gender equity.
Welcome to 99 Humans. My name is Jeff Lakusta, curious coach and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, striving to understand how little things generate big impact.
And I'm Nadia, Carta, tech executive and lifestyle coach with a mission to transform lives and corporations by kindling hearts to generate a zeal for life.
Each week, we investigate stories about the human side of leadership to re-energize your spirit and help you become a stronger leader.
Because the reality is that leadership is messy, goofy, challenging, but always human.
Thanks for spending time with us today. Let's dive in.
All right. Welcome, Jennifer, to 99 Humans.
Thank you, Jeff. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
So happy to have you here today. We've got Jennifer McCollum, the CEO of Catalyst, which is an incredible leadership development firm. And you have had quite the illustrious career at places like Korn Ferry, Intravision, all the way back to Coca-Cola, in addition to your work as co-chair of the Women's Business Collaborative and being the author of In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO, Overcoming Hurdles to Change the Face of Leadership, which is such an amazing title for, culminating some of the work that you've been doing in gender equality for leadership, which makes me very excited to have you on a show like 99 Humans, because we're really interested in peeking behind the incredible resumes like yours to understand more of that human side of leadership. And I'm in corporate America. Nadia, my co-host, who can't be here today, is in corporate America. So I know that gender equality in the workplace is a big topic and is a big challenge. I've seen it face to face, do what I can in terms of allyship. But I'm curious, maybe just to start off, how do you see progress on this topic? What is the state of the state when it comes to gender equality in the workplace?
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, that's a broad question. And if you go back 30 years and look at where we are today, I think it's really easy to see progress we've made. I mean, in the 1970s, women couldn't even have a credit card if their husband didn't co-sign with them. In the workforce, women weren't represented really at all back, 30 to 50 years ago. And so we've made a lot of progress. The problem is the progress is so glacially slow. And there's pendulum swings. And we need to make sure the pendulum now is swinging in the wrong direction. I'll give you a few statistics in a moment. But we need to make sure when the pendulum swings, it doesn't swing back as far as it was before. So just to give you a couple statistics, in the Fortune 500, there are less than 10% of women who are CEOs. And you go down the pipeline into the C-suite and senior leadership, it's about 25, 24%. And as you go down the management pipeline, at that very first level, when men and women equally entering the workforce, at that first level of promotion, you already start to see the disparity, whereas 60% of men and 40% women now are represented at that first line of leadership. So our goal in this work is to make sure we're moving the pipeline so that we can change those numbers faster. So this data just came out, but in the S&P 500, there are only 39 trailblazing women. That means 461 of them are men. And the pace of change is so slow that it's going to take us well over 100 years to even approach gender equity.
I know this is a multi-layered question, but what is going on because we know this is a problem. I would guess the male CEOs of these Fortune 500 companies have programs dedicated to making this better and talk about these same statistics, even though arguably the collective, the system that is letting these folks get such a outnumbered male versus women representation is part of that problem.
I'm actually so glad you started with the word systems, because I think the natural default for many, many years has really been, well, let's just fix the women. Like, let's just develop them. Let's just find them. Oh my gosh, like in the technology industry, they just don't even exist. And so there's been kind of like, if we can just fix the women problem, then we can fix the gender equity problem, whether it's representation or pay or promotion. But the truth is, women do not need to be fixed. When we look at our leadership data, women are exceptional leaders and they have exceptional leadership potential, but the systems around them are not necessarily supporting their rise. So you said it, like, what is the role of the people that have the power and influence? And the vast majority are men, and most of them are white men. So there are a select few incredible organizations with incredible leaders who have said, this is going to be our priority or a priority. We're going to make sure we have the pipelines. We're going to make sure we wrap them with the appropriate sponsorship and mentorship and give them access to stretch experiences. We're going to make sure when we open the door, we have the women walk in and ensure they're successful on the other side. We're going to make sure they're paid equitably. And in fact, Catalyst has, it's called the CEO Champions for Change. And there are 80 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies that have said, choose me. We are going to give you our data anonymously every single year, and Catalyst is going to measure that data. It's about women on our board, women represented in the C-suite and all levels of leadership, women's levels of promotion and retention. So Catalyst has this amazing research organization, and we track the CEO Champion for Change companies relative to the ones who aren't making those initiatives. And we see, not surprisingly, the numbers are significantly different. So that's what gives me hope, Jeff.
I think that's really powerful. I'm definitely a believer that you can't change what you aren't tracking. And so starting by increasing visibility of the problem and really dialing in and going, look where we are. It's been 12 months. Did anything change? If not, no. If yes, why? But I think that's a really powerful angle to starting that process of change that you're describing.
Yeah, and it happens at all levels. And so I know, like, for your listeners who may be in the C-suite and maybe in middle management or maybe just starting out in their career, I think it's important for all of us to know, like, what is our role? Women supporting women, but really gender allyship, because there are so many more men represented in leadership at all levels, but at senior levels and executive levels mostly. Like, what is my role as a gender ally in helping the advancement of women? I have a great story about my husband, who is in the financial services industry, and he's a senior level. He's in sales. He's in specialty healthcare finance. And he came to me and said, Jennifer, like, there's just really nothing that I can do. I get your perspective on how all of us need to help, but I don't have any power to change our talent systems. I don't have a team under me. I'm an individual contributor. So I get the issue is important, but there's nothing I can do. And I tell this story because I think it's typical of great men who are sitting on the sidelines going, I don't know, what can I do? And I said to him, do you have experiences that a rising woman in your orbit, it may not even be on your team, but someone you work with on the risk side, on the credit side, not the sales side, anyone that you see potential in that would benefit from your experiences? And he said, oh yeah, I actually, like, Rona is a woman who has asked me for support. And I said, well, could you formalize that? Could you meet with her, every single month and help her develop her skills and develop her brand and to promote her when she's in the room and when she's not in the room? And so the other day, it was about a month ago, he came running to me and he said, sign this book. Like, he had a copy of my book. They're all over my house. Sign it. I'm having lunch with Rona. And I said, oh, okay, what's going on with her? And he said, she's up for a promotion. but I can tell she doesn't feel like she's ready. She doesn't feel like she deserves it. And I know she does. And I want her to read your book because she needs that recognized confidence that people believe in her. And I looked at him and I said, I'm so glad you're helping Rona, but more importantly, this is what gender allyship looks like. And you told me a year ago that you had no power, and you do. So I just want to
love that. Such a spark for your husband, it sounds like, and for all of us on we can do something in rooms that we're in with people that we know. And I think you described this voice that maybe Rona had as the inner critic. And I'd love for you to unpack that phrase for me. What does the inner critic mean? And maybe what's a time where you've seen in your own journey that your inner critic may have been, sabotaging your hopes and dreams?
I love that your podcast is called 99 Humans, because all of us at any level, despite our, what people may be seeing on social media or on our websites or in our branding, like we are all humans. And as humans, we all have what is called this inner critic. It's this voice of judgment that really, while we all hold it, it tends to be louder for women, and it can paralyze us from moving forward. And I'll just give you an example of what that sounds like. It could sound like, I'm not ready. I'm not worth it. I shouldn't. Ask for that raise, ask for that promotion, speak up in that meeting. So that voice is going on in all of our heads all day long, but again, much louder for women. So when does it surge? It surges throughout the course of any day for any one of us. But when we're in experiences where we are uncomfortable, or they're new, or they're at the edge of our challenge or comfort zone, they tend to spike louder. So for me, I tell the story in the book, 6 years ago or so, when I was in the running for the CEO job, for my first CEO job, despite the fact I had run business units and publicly traded companies, when the headhunter called and asked if I would be, open to consideration of a private equity backed portfolio company that was actually the same size as business units that I'd run before, but all of a sudden that inner critic spiked. It was, well, you're not ready to be a CEO. You've only managed to the gross margin line, not to the net income or the EBITDA line. You need to be a number 2 first before you can jump into the CEO. Someone needs to groom you and train you. Like, what kind of mother are you? You've got 3 kids. And so that voice was just relentless. And I almost backed away from the greatest job that I had ever had until that point. If I wouldn't have done that, I would have regretted it forever. And that inner critic almost prevented me from doing it. So let me pause there, because I'll talk about how I overcame it if you want to hear the rest of the story.
I definitely want to hear how do we tame this beast? Because I think it exists for both genders. And one thing I'm curious about, and I'm kind of making a guess here, but I think it'd be easy to listen to that and go, oh, maybe it's so strange. I wonder why women have a louder inner critic. Maybe that's related to, gender. And I think it comes back to that first point we were discussing of systems that are kind of imprinting this on young girls. And then we go, oh, it's louder in women, but it's kind of our own fault with the way that society is designed, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's again, I know you've read pieces of my book, but I love how astute you are in these observations. So, again, the way, where do we hear our messages growing up? It could be from the family, it could be from society and our communities, and it could be in the workforce. So I talked about starting the work, in my role, starting off at a very large, consumer products company where I looked up and there just was nobody that looked like what I aspired to be. Right? I aspired to be a professional executive and a mother with a life that looked like I could manage, all of the things that were important to me. And I didn't have any role models. I didn't have anyone kind of grabbing me by the arm and saying, oh, I'm going to show you the way. I'm going to show you how it worked for me. I mean, what I saw were really smart white men who had women partners primarily who stayed at home and did all of the homework, the housework, the elder care work, so that they were free to do all of the professional work, right? And so the systems that we grow up in obviously feed us. And when I say, can I be a mom and a CEO? That was really my lived experience. But here's what happened. two men in my network. And this is where, again, gender allyship is so important. We had all run pieces of that publicly traded company together, and they were looking at private equity portfolio company roles, CEO roles. And they literally sat me down and had an intervention. And again, we were having lunch in Georgetown on the river, and I was kind of concerned. I was voicing my concerns about being qualified for the job. And they just looked at me kind of like incredulous. Like it had never occurred to them to ask those questions of themselves. And they said, well, if we're applying for these jobs and we think we can do it, and you were managing the same kinds of things at our last company, what is wrong with you? Like, why don't you think you can do it? Like, if not now, when? And it was like this awakening. Like it was not even a second thought for them. And yet it was paralyzing me.
Once you were a CEO for the first time, now you have many years of experience. Are there still moments of awakening to push that inner critic down? And what tips do you have now when you notice it? Or does it always feel like a surprise when you're on the other side still?
No, this is the great thing about the awareness of the inner critic and what you can do about it. And that's actually one of the big focuses of the book is the inner critic actually exacerbates and makes all of the other hurdles that women face on their rise to leadership, makes them worse. So if there's one thing that you can really focus on, it is that. So to answer your first question, yes, it rises again and again and again, but I've gotten so much better now at noticing it. So launching a book in not even a year ago, in 2023, it was my first book as a first-time author. I've been writing my whole life. I've been presenting my whole life, but there was something about putting a book into the world that felt it was challenging. It was vulnerable. There's a lot of my personal stories in that book. My inner critic shot right up. Like, I'm not a real author. Nobody's going to buy this. Why am I doing this anyway? Like, what CEO writes a book with personal stories? There was all kinds of stuff going through my head. But the good news was I could see it. And as soon as I could acknowledge it and pause, that's kind of the first step is awareness. Second step is stop. Third step is find compassion. Compassion for yourself if it's pointed at you. I didn't mention this, but inner critic can equally be pointed at others, like, again, judging others or judging yourself. And once you have that compassion, it's like, wait a minute, this is a new experience. I've earned this experience to be a CEO or to be an author, but it is a new experience. And it's creating these feelings of uncertainty and angst and concern.
Yeah.
But now let's get curious. And that's the fourth step. My name is on a book. It's getting published out in the world. We're having a big launch event with 3,000 women at the Women in Leadership Institute. Like, I am a real author, and it's uncomfortable. But so the length of time you kind of get embroiled in this inner critic spiral gets shorter as soon as you become aware of it and pause and find compassion.
You're doing it. And from reading pieces so far of your book, it's incredible. So I'm so glad that you found the courage to do this. And it seems like courage is what leads to all great things that are out there. But the words that you're using to get that courage, compassion, things like that, I mean, what place do you find there is for compassion and other emotions like that in the workplace, where still, even though we talk all the talk of authenticity, it doesn't feel like the workplace really wants that? I'm still coming up the workplace, and I sometimes struggle with, is this really what's wanted? I feel like this is what's best, but other signals seem to show that the system just hasn't changed all that much.
I know, it's funny, like kind of the new mantra of bring your whole self to work, but not really, and not all the time. And actually, we write about this, or I write about this in the book, and it's really about evolving our perspective of what we call branding and presence. Like, how do we show up, and how do people see us? Now, again, women have much greater challenges with this, because if we show up too ambitious or too aggressive, then the perspective is we're not likable. This is called the double bind. But if we show up too compassionate or too kind or too collaborative, then we're too soft and we're not tough enough for the big job. So that double bind is very real, and women face it and men don't. So I think we have to be really honest about that. The triple bind is when you layer in any other form of underrepresentation, whether it's race and ethnicity. And then you think about things like, the angry Black woman. Well, now you have a leader and a woman and a race, whether it's Black or Latin, and there's additional bias and judgment, unconscious or conscious, that come with that. So that aside, here's what I am very optimistic about. This bring yourself full self to work is not a mandate. The better question in my mind is, who do I aspire to be? And do I feel like I can show up that way at work? So I'll give you a personal example. So as the CEO of the last company I ran, I was very clear that I wanted to be open, authentic, vulnerable, at the same time, inspiring and collaborative. Like I had this picture in my mind of how I wanted to show up as a leader. I was testing myself against that through my 360s, through my executive coach. But I also made the commitment that I wasn't going to show up, even with my private equity board, who were all white men, by the way, in the finance industry. I was going to show up who I was. And I wasn't going to contort myself either the way I spoke, the way I dressed, the way I presented myself. I was going to comport myself in the way that felt natural to me, because I didn't want to pretend anymore. And there's a lot of pretending. It's called assimilation that women tend to do often in their roles and in their companies. And that is what is changing, which I appreciate.
What happened for you personally when you kind of decided maybe to just live more authentically, both for you emotionally in terms of maybe the energy that it takes for you to show up at work every day, but also really from a business perspective? What happened as a CEO for your company when you show up this way?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So the first, it's actually completely, it's such a relief. And I hear, like, again, when you get into women's circles where they talk about like how you dress and where you wear your hair and how you're perceived, it's this sense of when I can show up feeling more comfortable as myself, everything else gets easier. It's less stressful. I'm less overwhelmed. There's less pretending. So the way I act in one scenario at home or with my friends is not different from the way I should. In a way, like I would invite men to consider this as well. Right. This whole like, well, I don't act like myself in other places. This is my work persona. That's really hard. Yeah. Right. So that's kind of number one. Number two, what I found is when I started kind of just letting that guard down, and I couldn't do it in all companies and all roles, but you start to realize when I can't do it, the cost is too high. So as I seek jobs, as I seek promotions, I did it when I found this job. It was one of my criterion. I have a board of directors who are all Fortune 500 CEOs. But even with them, in my first meetings with them, I wanted to make sure I could show up as me. Now, I'm a visionary, I'm strategic, I'm driven and motivated, but I'm also very open, honest, transparent, vulnerable. Could those things live together? And if they couldn't, I didn't want the role.
Can you give me an example of what it looks like for you as the CEO of a company to be open and vulnerable with your board?
Well, it's a great question, because I'm my first board meeting with this board in September. But I don't think it's I don't think it's revealing too much. I started this role a few months ago, and even before I started, I was engaging with the search committee, again, very high level Fortune 500 CEOs, and they were asking me. One of them had read my book and said, "You wrote in your book about struggling with your last board," and I told a few stories about how I had done things I wish I could have done differently had I had a do-over. And she said, "What would you do differently now that you've had your private equity experience and now you're moving into this new board?" It's a nonprofit board, but it's a very powerful board. And I said, based on that learning, here's what I would do. Here are the mistakes that I made. And I would engage with you all in much smaller groups and one-on-one. And I would like to feel like I could come to you and not be all buttoned up with all the answers. That I could go to a board, maybe not all 40 of them, but subsets of the board where I could just kind of let my guard down and be myself. And I will say, I just got back from Chicago this week, with one of our board members from one of the largest companies in the world. And I had a 45-minute meeting with her that said, it sounded like this. Here's where I'm noticing. Here's where I'm struggling. Here's where I really would like your help. But I didn't have to pretend like in 60 days I had all the answers. And I left going, that felt really good.
I love that example because when I hear it, you're right. I don't think that's typical things, maybe in quotes, old typical for what you might hear from a CEO. Like, these are the things that I've done wrong, and here's what I want to do differently. But why? As a listener, I find your story to be incredibly inspiring. It shows a growth mindset. It shows me that, gosh, as a company, we might learn from mistakes because I hope we're making mistakes, or maybe we're not trying enough risks. So there's so much good in this approach of showcasing a little bit of vulnerability with folks who also may be able to help, but will also be inspired and hopefully share some of their mistakes and learnings, as well as board members, because I'm sure and I hope that they'll make some with you along the way.
Yeah, I think there's this perspective with, whether it's board members or CEOs that, we should have it all figured out. And the reality is, and look, you're in the technology industry. I mean, the reality is things are moving too quickly and the world is too complex for any one person to have it all figured out. And so it's going to take a couple things. It's going to take, how do you pull in the right people with the right perspectives to solve really complex challenges? So for me, sometimes it's like on a personal level or a leadership level, it's my CEO coaching community. Like, I need help here. Sometimes it's innovation and I need different help. But the ability to say, I'm Jennifer and I've got some really good ideas about where we want to go, but I do not have it all figured out. And then your staff, like, how are you pulling in at all levels staff who feel like they can contribute? And in many organizations, I think there's this perception that everybody with the answers like resides at a certain level, and then it's just about pushing it down. Like, that model of leadership no longer works.
I think that is absolutely true. And one of the sort of telltale signs of that is this echo chamber idea, where leaders end up only surrounded by people who are saying the same things over and over. And the reality on the ground is so different than wherever that message is. What are things that you find work well to avoid that specific challenge that I actually see sometimes in roles that I have?
So I'll tell you another story about one of my personal mentors and favorite humans and leaders, and his name is Alan Mulally. Alan was I don't know, you may have heard of him. He was the CEO. He's retired now, but he was the CEO of Boeing when the Boeing airplanes went through the World Trade Center on 9/11, and he was the CEO of the Ford Motor Company during the Great Recession when the auto industry almost went under. And I had the great fortune of having him mentor me through the COVID-19 crisis while a CEO at Linkage. And he said, listen, Jennifer, you cannot manage a secret, especially in times of crisis. And I would even say in times of great change, and all of our organizations are in great change in some form or fashion, multiple changes, usually at the same time. He said, you have to create this transparency where everyone sees the problem and feels like they can have a role to play in it. You have to manage the metrics of success of the organization so that it's all visible. And I'll give you examples of how we do that. But you also have to create a culture of leadership principles and practices where everyone knows and understands what is the expectation, not only for what we want to create, but how we want to behave. And how do we hold ourselves accountable to that, either at the board level or at the senior leadership team level or any leadership level, wherever you are, even in cross-functional teams. Every single week at Linkage, the company I ran formerly, and now the company that I've joined, Catalyst, we do what's called a business plan review, where we bring anyone that manages any metric of the organization together every single week. And from a cross-functional perspective, these could be financial metrics, they could be innovation and product metrics, they could be efficiency metrics. Every single week, we're looking at them together. And there's a very simple red, yellow, green coding where we can quickly look and see where are the challenge areas. And let's swarm those challenge areas with the right people so that we can solve them quickly. And we're going to look at them again next week and the week after and the week after. So it creates this transparency and visibility and this feeling that we can all solve the greatest opportunities and challenges we have before us.
I am so glad we have had this time together. That is such a amazing strategic and tactical tip of ways to embody human leadership and make a difference on this challenge of gender equality in the workforce. And we always end our podcast with kind of this question of thinking back on our conversation, what advice do you have? And I kind of want to shift this question slightly based on our discussion. To get a little back to actions. What are things that listeners can do to show up and make a difference wherever they are in the workforce on gender equality? And I would love if you could maybe give us two nuggets. One for men who want to be allies, but also one for women, because I think a challenge we didn't discuss is sometimes women are the toughest on other women. And I think there's a role for allyship there as well. And so I'd love to hear some thoughts on the differences for how you can show up to make a difference, whether you're a man or a woman.
Perfect. Let's start with men first. So here's my message to you. We need you. Men, you represent at the top 90% of our CEOs, and even in the early level managers, you represent 60%. We cannot solve the gender equity problem without you. No matter where you sit, you can be an ally. You can look at someone who has not been speaking loudly, is not getting the proper credit for what she has done, is afraid to speak up because perhaps she's not getting the airtime. You can create the space and the visibility for her. And all the way up at the top, if you are a senior leader in a position of power and influence, you can use and point that power and influence to support people who don't look like you. It's more comfortable for us to promote, hire, develop, network with people who look like us, all of us. But if you are in a position of power and influence, whether you're a man or a woman, they just happen to be more men, it is your obligation and responsibility to point that power and influence to support a more gender diverse executive team, boardroom, and all levels of leadership. If you are a woman, please know that the path is harder for you. And it's a well-trodden path for generations and decades, and we are making progress. But it is up to us to make sure we understand the challenges that we face and to do our own work in overcoming our inner critic, overcoming that internalized bias, clarifying what we want to aspire and achieve, making the ask for what we really want, not the watered down version of what we think we deserve. These to establish a network like Alan Mulally, who is willing to help and sponsor and mentor you. So it is our job to do our own work, while it's the job of the people in power, mostly the gender allies, to help evolve the systems in which we work.
I love that. A call to action and an acknowledgement that it is harder. I think that helps avoid some of that dissonance of what's going on. Why does it feel this way? You're not crazy. Maybe gaslight gets used too much, but gosh, that word comes to mind here.
Yeah, and I think any word, like gosh, even DEI is like, and any word can be polarizing. I think unconscious bias has become a little polarizing. I want to just move away from all that and talk about what is my role as a professional, as a leader that can help support an environment where all of us can thrive.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on. I have no doubt that people will be interested in connecting with you and buying your book. Where can folks find you?
LinkedIn is great. Jennifer Shear McCollum, CEO of Catalyst. You can also go to jenmccollum.com. McCollum, and you can find out a lot more information about the book. You can buy the book anywhere, Amazon or elsewhere. And my newest role is at catalyst.org. And that organization is doing incredible work in the world and has for 62 years to accelerate the progress for women in the workplace.
Incredible. Well, they are so lucky to have you. We are so lucky to have you on this podcast. Thank you. We'll put all of these links in the show notes. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I loved our conversation.